When I was 16 in the mid-1990s, I used to run away from my crappy living situation at home and spend weeks-long excursions at my older teenage friends' places. One of these hovel-wise Xanadu's was my friend Jay's apartment, located at the very top of a mostly empty 5-story complex in an absolutely terrifying high-crime part of the city. The entire building, except the very bottom floor, was vacant except for Jay. It was a particularly isolating sense of freedom being there, as well as extra creepy. Upon Jay's moving into said dump, we noticed something remarkable right away. This place was undeniably and very obviously haunted. This was made known the very moment I cleared the threshold on moving day, carrying a heavy box of Jay's books. A large, warm hand ran straight up the back of my bare right thigh. I was wearing a tiny skirt even though it was autumn, because teenager, and the sensation of the hand running up the back of my upper thigh turned to a pinch of my butt cheek. I was frozen, of course, and could only think to fretfully call out to Jay, who was in the bedroom inflating at $10. Air mattress. G, did you just pinch my butt? He stuck his head out of the room and looked at me like I was insane and responded, no. I told him what had just happened, and instead of scared, he seemed amused, because it was a silly situation to describe. After this incident, though, there was no end to the weird shit that routinely comprised an average day in his tiny one-bedroom. Set something down, it would disappear immediately. Walk into a room, the door would slam behind you, only to immediately reopen itself. Ready to force yourself to sleep through the confusion and only slightly amusing terror, hear the sounds of dishes and cupboards being banged around in the kitchen. One night, Jay's boyfriend stayed over, and the guy woke up the next morning with a stinging red bite mark on his wrist. The teeth marks didn't match his or Jay's or mine, and we had been the only 3 there. So it was absolutely no surprise when Jay's house keys went missing. We tore the place apart looking for them, to no avail. It was Christmas Eve, so getting in touch with the apartment office to get a replacement key was not possible. Jay's mom, in the meantime, had invited the 2 of us over for dinner that night. So we made the decision to just leave the door unlocked this once, so we could go. We won't be gone long, we reckoned, and headed out bundled up for the walk to Jay's mom's house. We ended up leaving a bit later than expected, about 11 p.m., but the streets were totally isolated by this point due to the holiday and freezing weather. This made it particularly noticeable when we realized we were being followed home. The man behind us was making no effort to disclose his action. He came out of absolutely nowhere and stayed behind us, keeping a pace of only about 9 or 10 feet. I looked over at Jay, and this was the first time I had ever in my life seen him scared. The man behind us was easily 6'5", 300 pounds of fat and muscle. If you've ever seen a professional NFL player in real life, he was that size. His black eyes were laser focused on us. A couple of scrawny teenagers in thrift store polyester bell-bottoms. We were clearly poor, so he must have wanted, I don't know, something else from us, which gave this whole scenario an even darker turn. We increased our pace. He increased his pace. We turned a corner. He turned a corner. Unfortunately, every shop or business front we passed was closed, and cell phones were still brick-sized novelties used only by Miami Vice villains or dickheads in convertibles. There was literally no one else around except the 3 of us, lit only by passing Christmas lights. We finally approached the apartment stairs. We are terrified to go up and announce where we lived to this freak, but we didn't know what else to do but to get inside, lock the door, and maybe call the cops if we had to. We ascend to the first stair landing. He follows. 2nd floor, 3rd floor. Jay and I are sharing looks of panic as we try and remain calm as he clomps slowly right behind us. 4th floor. There he is, close enough to reach out and grab us. We get to the apartment door, and the man has stopped and is now just staring at us intently from the landing, waiting as Jay and I stare helplessly at each other for what seemed like an eternity. I discreetly reach to open the door, and it is locked. Deadbolt from the inside. I start to sweat and almost scream when Jay decided to knock on the door. I began knocking, too, and said as casually, cheerfully as I could to the door, "Hey, it's us. Open up." The deadbolt clicked. The man, seeing that there was someone unseen inside the apartment, turns around on the landing and walks away. We run inside, slam and lock the door behind us. Pretty sure we pushed the couch in front of the door as well. We holler out, "Thank you," to the ghost and laugh nervously at our sudden relief of fear, though still too shaken up to talk about what just happened, any of it. The next morning, Jay's house keys were mysteriously returned to the bare counter by the door, where he'd always kept them. It did not occur to me until later that had the keys not been missing, this gigantic night stalker would have known that we were there all alone. A few years ago, I was getting ready to move from Cleveland, Ohio, south to Columbus. A week before my move, I went out of town with a friend. We stayed for a weekend and drove back the following Monday. The drive was long. We were both hungover, and all I could envision was getting to my own car, inhaling some fries, and sprawling on my couch. Plus, my roommate had already moved out. So, when I got home, it was just going to be me and my cat, Harley. I was ready. So sure enough, my friend dropped me off in my car that Monday evening. I drove down the street to McDonald's for some fries and a shake, and then was finally home. When I opened the front door, Harley was right there waiting, like she usually does when she hears my key in the lock. But as I walked in that night, she was crying, making this horrific noise she doesn't usually make. Normally, when I get home, Harley chirps a little, but this was a mewling that sounded painful. I knew something was up. Of course I asked her, "What's wrong, girl?" and then looked around. That's when I noticed the TV I had in the living room was gone. I immediately ran up the steps to my bedroom, and that TV was gone, too. I ran back down the steps and called my roommate, asking if she had decided to borrow the TVs for the weekend, which I knew was super unlikely, but I was also trying to be optimistic. Of course she said no, and then said she'd come over, because obviously someone had broken in. I called another friend who had helped watch Harley while I was gone. He, too, said that there had been TVs there all weekend, but that he hadn't been in the house since Sunday night. I went outside, sweating, realizing that I might not be alone in the house. I was afraid to go near the basement or my roommate's empty room. I called the police. I called my landlord. Everyone converged on the house. It was only when the police were there that I went into the backyard and discovered that our kitchen window had been expertly removed. The window was propped against our recycling bin, which was on its side. The police asked me if I had any idea who would want my TVs, and some other objects we discovered were missing, although the TVs were the most glaring items. I couldn't think of anyone. My landlord kept asking if I had any exes that I had pissed off, which I thought was weird, and I insisted that there wasn't even an ex, much less an angry one. He asked at one point, "Not even a dude you rejected at the bar?" To which I asked how a guy I had rejected would know where I lived. With all of the paperwork filed, the police said that a detective would come by in the morning to fingerprint the window and some other areas of the house. They advised me not to stay in the house that night, given that sometimes repeats happen. They also told my landlord not to touch the window itself, but that he could board the window opening with plywood temporarily. The police said everything in the backyard needed to stay exactly as it was. I asked if my landlord wanted me to stay while he boarded the window. He said no, and told me to go stay with my roommate for the night. I slept but was unsettled. The next morning, I met the detective at the house. When we got to the backyard, the whole scene had been rearranged. The recycling bin had been moved across the yard. The window was flipped. Items that had been scattered from our kitchen in the backyard were thrown away. I told the detective, who kind of shrugged it off, and then he took fingerprints from the window as well as some furniture in the house. Everything had either been wiped down or touched by someone wearing gloves. He couldn't get any evidence from anything in the house or what was left in the backyard. After he left, I called the police department again, as I was still concerned that the scene had been rearranged. The police chief ended up on the phone with me. He told me to never be at the house alone. It seemed someone might not be done with me. Since I was moving anyway, this was easy enough. A friend with a pit bull sat with me the rest of the week while I packed. Harley and I stayed with my old roommate every night. I got a tattoo and had a going away party. I left the house behind. While I was driving to Columbus, though, I couldn't stop thinking about the break-in and the fact that someone had come back. It had been so clean. No broken windows, no broken locks, nothing. And then I remembered somehow that just after we moved into the house over a year before, my roommate and I had run into our landlord while we were out. We had said hi and moved on, but then he kept texting me, trying to get us to a different bar. We never met up with him that night and never saw him out again. He's the only person I rejected who also knew where I lived. My story is something that happened to me back when I was a teen. It took some time for me to recount it to friends, like 10 years, because it had scared me so much at the time. I also refused to sleep in my room for about a month afterwards. And needless to say, I now sleep with my curtains firmly shut. I grew up in a remote northeastern town in the province of Quebec. After my parents separated, my mom moved my siblings and I into an older house on a cul-de-sac street. The neighborhood was for the most part a decent place to raise kids and teens. However, the area had experienced issues with a high volume of break-ins in the recent years before we bought the house. The previous owners had installed locking metal braces on the basement windows to prevent potential intruders from entering. Our next-door neighbor had placed a huge spotlight on a pole in his backyard that subsequently lit our yard as well. This kind of stuff was foreign to us, as my hometown is a place where people rarely lock their homes and cars. These precautions were unusual, practiced to us, and seemed a bit excessive. My mom had a 6-foot wooden fence built around one side of the house that enclosed all of the basement windows. This was not done out of fear of trespassers, but rather for added privacy and to define the borders of the property. I was about 14 at the time, and being the oldest kid, this meant I got dibs on the only basement bedroom. I was happy for the privacy, freedom to blast music, and access to my own bathroom. But the basement creeped me out with its old-fashioned cellar, loud furnace, spiral staircase, and a floor-to-ceiling wall of mirrors in the TV room. It was dark. The furnace made strange noises at night, and I was far away from where the rest of my family slept. The window in my room was basically a half window because the surrounding area had been dug out and an aluminum window well installed. I wasn't too keen on the darkness of the creepy basement, so I usually slept with my curtains open. My neighbor's spotlight partly shone into my room, creating a sort of nightlight. My bed directly faced the window, but I felt comfortable not closing my curtains since my window was enclosed by the wooden fence. One night, I was in my bed nodding out, not awake, but also not quite asleep yet. For some reason, I opened my eyes and looked towards my window. I could see something in the area where the window well met the grass, the top half of my window that was unobstructed. I didn't have my glasses on, so I couldn't see very well, and the light was shining into my room, making it harder to see outside. Initially, I thought it was an object that had blown up to the window, like maybe a soccer ball or a bag. Groggy and not quite awake still, I sat up in bed to get a better look. The object started to resemble a face. I leaned my body from one side of my bed and then to the other, trying to catch a glimpse at a different angle. In doing that, I could finally see the features of a man's face. The face slowly turned and followed my movements as I shifted from side to side in my bed. He was completely expressionless, just intently looking at me. I froze. There was someone outside, laying belly down on the grass and looking at me from that small exposed top half of the window. After a moment of being frozen, I reacted, and in one giant leap, hopped out of my bed and ran upstairs. I went to my mom's room and got in her bed, thoroughly freaked out but also confused at what I'd just seen. She woke up and asked me what I was doing, and I told her that I thought I saw a face in my window. She got up and took a look through her bedroom window but didn't see anything. She was much more dismissive than alarmed since I didn't know for sure what I'd seen, and there was no sign of anyone. Also, it was dark, and I didn't have my glasses on, so it was possible that I was mistaken. The next morning before school, I decided to go outside to the area where my bedroom window was, still unsure what I'd seen or not seen. The wooden fence surrounding the back of the house had a door, point of entry to the backyard. My window was the first next to that door. At some point earlier in the year, the handle had broken on the fence door and could fully latch on and stay shut. In order to prevent it from opening and becoming a noise nuisance in the wind, my mom had placed a cinder block up against the door on the inside of the fence. That morning, the cinder block was not blocking the door. It had been moved and the door was unlatched. Thinking back now, I must have been awoken from my not asleep/awake state by the dull thud of the cinder block toppling over in the grass. And sometime after that I came to the realization that there was a face in my window looking at me